Chapter 22 of the British Isles and the Baltic States by Frank G. Carpenter. This recording is in the public domain. The New Germany. I have known Germany for more than 40 years. My first trip here was made upon leaving college, when Kaiser Wilhelm I was still on the throne. I saw that famous monarch at Ems and shouted with the rest in his honor. I was here again in 1889 when I crossed Germany from one end to the other during my honeymoon trip around the world. My third visit was in 1892 when the young Kaiser, the man who now sits at Dorn amid his shattered dreams of world empire, had just dismissed Bismarck and was directing the affairs of the country for himself. Prince Bismarck had then retired to his private estate at Friedrichsruh, near Hamburg. I had the honor of meeting and talking with him there on his 77th birthday, and a few days later saw the youthful Kaiser review the great German army at Tempelhofer Feld, near Berlin. It was in 1902 that I came back again to find the country in the hands of a military aristocracy. Every one stepped aside for the officer and the soldier, and it was not safe to laugh aloud at the Kaiser lest one be sent to prison. I was then making a study of the American commercial invasion of Europe, and I went through factories in all parts of Germany, investigating the industries rising to greatness. Among other establishments, I visited that of Krupp's, which already was making big guns and munitions in preparation for the war of a dozen years later. 9 more years elapsed, and early in 1911 I found myself with my wife and daughter at a great musical festival in Munich, from where we went up the Rhine and traveled about here and there. Imperialism and militarism were then even more in evidence, and had I been a modern Daniel, I might have been able to read the handwriting appearing on the wall. Now, 20 years after my first visit, I am again in Germany. The sun of the Kaiser has risen and set, and the empire that included possessions in more than 3 continents has become a republic. It is building anew from the wreckage of its great adventure, and is slowly recovering from an after-war condition that has had few parallels in the history of the world. The sorest plight into which Germany descended following her defeat in the great struggle that reddened Europe with blood for 4 long years began to descend upon her in 1919, when she was forced by economic and financial difficulties to make the printing press the national cashier. With no gold in the treasury to back the flood of paper money pouring forth into circulation, the fall of the mark began. In August 1919 it dropped from par to less than a dime. 6 months later one could buy 50 marks for $1, and shortly after that 75. By January 1922 the mark had so fallen that it took 200 to equal $1 in gold. Nevertheless, the Germans still had faith in their government, and it was not until almost a year later that the national currency took its seat on the financial toboggan. Its first great descent was from 200 to 400 per dollar. Then it dropped to 600, and sliding downhill even faster, was soon quoted in terms of thousands to the dollar. Just before the French moved into the Ruhr, the mark was worth only 1 1/2 hundredths of a cent, and within a month after the occupation it had a value of only 2 1/1000ths of a cent. From time to time it came up a little, but always fell back farther than it rose, so that before the French occupation had lasted a year our bankers were offering 1,000,000 marks for 12 cents. With the utter collapse of the value of the mark, I venture that more than 98% of the people of Germany lost practically every pfennig of their pre-war savings. Investments in all sorts of gilt-edged securities and all municipal and government bonds became but little more than waste paper. Even pensions and life insurance policies were rendered practically worthless, as they were based on the paper mark and not on gold. As the mark shrank in value, debtors paid off the face value of their mortgages and notes with bales of paper money that had only a fraction of its former purchasing power, and a year's interest on bonds would not buy a square meal for the holder. Widows, pensioners, and even capitalists were plunged into poverty. All the solid accumulations of the past that had not been put into machinery or material properties dwindled to nothing. Real estate in Berlin was sold for a song, and valuable industrial properties were peddled out to financiers from other countries. The intellectuals, by which I mean students, professors, and scientists, were so reduced that the future of Germany as one of the leaders in advanced thought was in danger. Men who before the war were worth millions now went out to labor for their daily bread, and even then were fortunate if they made enough to give them the barest necessities of life. Women, also, formerly wealthy and idle, became utterly destitute. Some went out into service at pitiful wages, some took in sewing, some became scrub women in the public buildings, some walked the streets, carrying sandwich board advertisements of the vaudeville theaters, some hid their poverty by working secretly in homes where once they were society queens, and others starved rather than let their dire want to be known. Today, with the stabilization of the mark, the crisis of unemployment, poverty, and starvation has been passed, and Germany is struggling to its feet. But it is a far different Germany from the once autocratic empire of the Kaiser. Great changes having occurred both in the attitude of the people and their situation. Take the city of Berlin, for instance. Before the war it was one of the most strictly administered capitals on earth, and one could not build a dog kennel without submitting its plan and specifications to the municipal architects. Today, extra stories are being added to buildings in all parts of the city. New types of structures are going up, and some of the streets begin to have a sawtooth skyline. Under the Kaiser, not only the principal thoroughfares, but all the streets of Berlin were kept spick and span. A man could be arrested for throwing rubbish on the pavements, and anyone seen by a policeman dropping a scrap of paper on the sidewalk in any part of the city was made to pick it up. Today, Berlin is littered with trash that waits hours for the municipal cleaners. In the past there were no vagrants. Now there are beggars on every street corner. The blind go along led by dogs, the lame beg upon crutches, and those too proud to beg walk through the streets searching for crusts of bread or any stray thing of value. In pre-war times the posting of bills on the walls was most strictly forbidden. Today the city fathers sell the privileges of putting up posters on the electric light posts, in the windows of the branch post offices, and even on the street mailboxes. The mail wagons are decorated with advertisements, and announcements of "pink pills for pale people" stare one in the face as he gets his change at the stamp window. Indeed, the day may come when the postmaster of Berlin will strut about as a sandwich man. So far no billboards are allowed, but circular iron towers plastered over with advertisements decorate the street corners. Perhaps one notices the changes in Berlin most when he strolls along the famous avenue of Unter den Linden. Unter den Linden is about as wide as Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, and about two-thirds as long as Pennsylvania Avenue between the Capitol and the Treasury in Washington. Along it are some splendid buildings, and in the old days it was the sacred highway of the Kaiser. At certain hours of the day no one was permitted to smoke there or to speak loudly, and a man was liable to arrest if his dog barked there after dark. No business vehicles or automobiles were allowed upon it. Today the linden trees from which it was named, and which were intended to lend it great dignity and beauty, look scrawny and poorly cared for. Now, too, it is one of the noisiest streets of the capital. Students and half-drunken hoodlums go through it at night singing and shouting, and by day it is thronged with plebeian traffic like that of any other street. Apparently every foreigner in Berlin feels most at home on Unter den Linden. Cook's touring cars and sightseeing buses stand at every corner. People gather in groups and smoke and joke. A Berliner told me that if he listened carefully he might once in a while hear a word of German on Unter den Linden, but not very good German at that. Like his pet avenue, the Kaiser's favorite palace also has been given over to the people. I mean the one at the foot of Unter den Linden, in which he spent most of his time. When I visited it 2 decades ago, I had to put on felt slippers and was warned to speak in a whisper. Then but 40 or 50 people came to the palace even on busy days. Now something like 10,000 persons often visit it in a day, and they may wear hobnailed shoes without reproof. There are guides if you want them, and they make their comments without fear or favor. From Berlin I crossed the country south to Munich and the border of Switzerland, and traveled from the great manufacturing plants and mines of the Ruhr Valley east to the frontier of Poland. The Germans complain of the great territorial losses as a result of the war, but their country has still an area of more than 180,000 square miles. It is more than 3 times the size of New England, and bigger than Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and West Virginia combined. It is about 1½ times as large as Great Britain and Ireland, and it has now more than 60 million people, or nearly 3/5 as many as there are in the United States. Prussia alone has a population equal to that of New England, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Illinois. The new republic is one of big cities. Greater Berlin, with its 4 million and more people, is half again as large as Chicago and more than twice the size of Philadelphia. Hamburg, with 1 million or more, tramps on the heels of Detroit. Cologne is bigger than Boston. Munich has more people than Pittsburgh, and Dresden is larger than Buffalo. Leipzig is crowding Los Angeles, Dusseldorf outranks Cincinnati, and Essen, the home of Krupp's, which before the war had 400,000 people, has 600,000 today. Germany has 4 other cities, each of which has more than 300,000 inhabitants. It has 8 ranging between 2 and 300,000, and 15 more of 100,000 each. Some of these cities are unknown to most of us. How many of you can locate Gelsenkirchen and Duisburg, for instance? The one first named is bigger than Memphis, and the second surpasses in size Omaha, Atlanta, or Toledo. One might think from listening to the Germans that they had lost for all time their agricultural and mineral wealth. The fact is that they still have one of the most productive properties in Europe. The greater part of their soil is as rich as that of France, and from their vast mines of potash they obtain for it good fertilizer at a comparatively low cost. The nitrates they are manufacturing from the air promise to supplant those from the mines of Chile. Their per acre production of grain, potatoes, and sugar beets is far higher than ours and equal to that of almost any other land of the world. However, Germany has long since changed from an agricultural to an industrial nation, and, as in Great Britain, without the profits of her factories and shipping she would be unable to pay her bills. She is peppered with up-to-date industrial establishments in which millions work at a lower wage per month than some American mechanics get in one week. In transportation, she has the advantage over most other countries of Europe. The northern part is a level plain, and practically the whole of it is a gentle slope toward the Baltic, so that railroads can be cheaply built and cheaply run. The country now has enough railways to make 13 trunk lines from Boston to San Francisco. Germany has a vast net of interior waterways. It has 3 navigable rivers, which are connected by so many canals that if you could make a great subway through the center of the earth from one side to the other, it would not equal their total length. Upon all these waterways great quantities of freight are carried. I have no figures for the present, but in 1913 more than 100 million tons of goods were shipped on the rivers and inland capitals of Germany, and more than half of this tonnage was made up of domestic manufactures. Before 1914, industrial Germany was capturing markets from Peking to Paris, from Berlin to Baghdad, and from the Rio Grande to the Straits of Magellan. It was the Samson of the commercial world, everywhere victorious, until charmed by the Delilah of military ambition. Now, the country is once more rapidly regaining its old place on the ocean, and pushing its goods in all parts of the globe. The Germans have their salesmen in every country, their banks are agencies in every big city, and they are all working together to get back a share of world trade. They are especially strong in Eastern Europe, and are far ahead of any other country in the volume of their business with Russia and Turkey. Germany has always studied the special tastes of its customers and manufactured to suit them, and it is this factor that is largely aiding in recapturing its lost trade. Although fallen far from the military position it once occupied among the leading nations of the world, it has made huge strides toward regaining the commercial and industrial eminence for which it was once noted in the four corners of the globe. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of the British Isles and the Baltic States by Frank G. Carpenter. This recording is in the public domain. The Republic of Poland. I come from Washington, the capital of the United States. This was my answer to a well-dressed, intelligent-looking young man while we waited together in front of the cashier's window of the largest bank in Warsaw. The man replied, "Washington is not the capital of the United States. Albany is the capital." "Is that so?" said I. "Yes," was the reply. "It was moved some years ago. I know that Washington was the capital, but Albany is the capital now. I have a friend who has just come from America, and he told me so." This conversation shows what one Pole knows of our country. I doubt not there are many Americans who have quite as hazy ideas of Poland. Do you know that Poland is one of the biggest countries in Europe? It is larger than Norway, or Italy, or Great Britain and Ireland, and only Russia, Sweden, France, Germany, and Spain surpass it in size. Do you know that it has, in round numbers, between 25 and 30 million people, or more than 3 times as many as has all of New England? Do you know that the Poles in America number more than 4 million, and that for a decade prior to the World War they were sending back home more than $40 million a year? Do you know that Poland is more thickly populated than almost any part of our country, and that it has more people to the square mile than has New York State, including New York City? It has more than 50 cities exceeding 25,000 in population. Warsaw, the capital, is almost twice as big as Washington, D.C. Lodz, the great textile center, outranks Cincinnati. Lemberg has more citizens than Omaha, and Krakow, the old capital, is fast growing to 200,000. And perhaps you have forgotten that these Poles were once more powerful than the Russians or the Germans, that they had what was practically a republican government 200 years before we declared our independence of England, and that even in the Middle Ages they were noted everywhere for their civilization and culture. I wonder, too, if you realize what kind of people are the Poles of today. You may have associated them with Protestant Germany or Greek Catholic Russia, but the majority of them are neither Protestants nor Greek Catholics. They are members of the Roman Catholic Church, and the new constitution declares Roman Catholicism to be the dominant religion. Poland is also a land of the Jews, with 40 times as many Israelites as there are in Palestine. It has more Jews than any other country in Europe, and just about 1/5 of all there are in the world. More than 1/3 of Warsaw is occupied by Hebrews. The city has a large Jewish quarter containing 600 synagogues. Its streets are thronged with people who look more like the typical Jew of the stage than those we know in our cities. The Polish Jew often appears in the ancient costume of his people. He then wears a skull or fur cap with no visor, and a long black cloak buttoned up to the neck and falling almost to the feet. His face is covered with whiskers, and a long spiral curl usually hangs down on each side of his face in front of his ears. This is according to the law laid down in Leviticus. "Thou shalt not mar the corners of thy beard." These people bear little resemblance to the well-dressed, up-to-date Jew of the United States. Their ancestors came chiefly from Spain and Germany, where they were persecuted. Their migrations began 100 years or so before Columbus discovered America, and at a time when Poland welcomed all immigrants. Today, the Jews do a large part of the business of Poland. In the past, every rich landowner had a Jew managing his property, buying and selling and making his bargains. They are now the middlemen of the republic. They do not take to farming, and are essentially traders. I see their stores everywhere, and their business signs are quite as often in Hebrew as in Polish. They are interested also in politics and have their representatives in Parliament. Poland is a great plain of fat soil that before the World War was producing farm products equal in value to 3 times the gold output of the world. About half the people are engaged in agriculture, and they have under the plow an area twice as large as Ohio. The country raises millions of bushels of wheat, rye, oats, and barley, and its potato crop at times runs as high as 800 million bushels. It is a cattle breeding country and raises also hogs, horses, and sheep. The prairies and pastures would make 3 states the size of Massachusetts, and the forests would cover the state of Virginia. This republic is also one of the big mineral properties of Europe. It has something like 2,000 square miles of coal lands and is now mining millions of tons every year. The coal reserves of Upper Silesia exceed those of Great Britain, and their cession to Poland was a serious loss to industrial Germany. Poland has also deposits of iron, zinc, lead, and copper, besides some of the greatest salt mines of the world. One of the salt beds has been worked for centuries, and has, it is estimated, a reserve of 23 million tons. In the southern part of the country are rich deposits of petroleum. As for its industries, before the war Poland was producing annually almost $1,000 million worth of manufactures and had almost 2 million workers. It is today one of the great textile centers of Europe, making cottons and woolens for Russia, the Balkans, and other neighboring countries. Its metal industries are important too. Much iron and steel are used in Poland, and before the war the value of the annual exports of machinery to Russia alone ran into the millions. On my way to Warsaw from Germany, I made a trip through the coal and iron region of Polish Silesia and stopped for a while in Katowice, the Pittsburgh of Poland. As we approached it, we rode for miles with smokestacks in sight, passing many plants engaged in the production of steel, zinc, and lead. There are 50 coal mines here, employing 150,000 men, and there are an even larger number of workers in the factories and foundries. The rolling mills, steel plants, and mines of Katowice were developed by the Germans, who before the war owned this part of Poland and who did all they could to Germanize the people at the same time. They formed colonization societies to which the Polish peasants were practically forced to sell their lands. They established public schools in which only German was taught, and I am told that the teachers whipped the children for speaking Polish on the playgrounds. The officials tried also to prevent the use of the Polish language in any public meetings, and they changed the names of the villages, putting German signs over the railway stations. What caused the most trouble was an attempt to prohibit religious instruction in any other language than German. In 1900, an edict went forth that even the prayers and the catechism must be recited in German. This caused a mighty sensation, and the children, backed by their parents, went on strike. They tore up the German catechisms and sang songs deriding the officials. They compared the Prussians to Pharaoh and Herod, and at one time there were 100,000 children who refused to say German prayers. The government tried to put down the strike. The children were punished with whippings and their parents were fined. The Germans finally prevailed, but the feeling aroused against them was so bitter that it remains to this day. At present Polish is the language of the schools, but the German children may study in their own language. Any one may speak whichever tongue he desires, and the Polish railway employees are required to know German. If Katowice is the Pittsburgh of Poland, its Manchester is Lodz, which is in the region formerly governed by Russia. Imagine a great dreary plain, in its midst a dreary city as big as Cincinnati. Let the city have 1,000 smokestacks rising high above the houses, and let its buildings run for 3 miles along 2 narrow streets paved with cobbles. Put short cross streets here and there, and you have the somber outlines of Lodz, the great textile center of Poland. A closer view shows a mighty factory under each smokestack, a mass of brick and glass that seems to wall in the gloom, making the scene more dreary than ever. The people resemble their surroundings. The town is composed of factory workers, and it seems to be poverty's kitchen. A large proportion of the inhabitants are lower class Israelites, who go about with unshaven faces, wearing the long gabardines that have been their costumes from time immemorial. In the street traffic are quaint covered wagons driven by ragged peasants, droshkis without number, and ungainly carts loaded with huge bales of cotton and cloth. There are also carts pulled by men and shoved along by women walking behind. We see men and women carrying on their backs great loads, sometimes held on by a strap around the forehead, reminding us of the Mexican peons. The automobile and the motor truck are conspicuous by their absence. Manpower and horsepower do most of the work. It was some time after Napoleon was overthrown that Alexander I of Russia started the factories of Lodz by offering grants of forests and lands to German weavers if they would come here and set up their looms. They came by the thousand, and the industry was established under high protective tariffs. When the World War broke out, Lodz had 400 mills, which had sprung into being at the command of the Czar. During the war, this industry was destroyed by the German invaders. They captured Lodz in 1914 and went through factory after factory, looting each of its brass and copper. As a result, the city was left as bare as a bone. In the years since the armistice, every factory has been re-equipped with modern machinery, and some of the mills are now working 3 shifts a day. More than 125,000 men and women are employed, and the goods made are sold not only in Poland, but in other lands of the Baltic and in Roumania and Bulgaria. In going through one of the mills, I stopped and talked with the employees. The men looked much the same as those in our woolen mills, save that every one of them had a mustache. There were many women, old and young, and now and then I saw one with a baby. Most of the women had handkerchiefs around their heads, and nearly all were barefooted. Many of these workers live in a tenement belonging to the factory. The manager said it contained accommodations for 8,000 people, and when I asked how many rooms were allowed for each family, he answered that some had 1 room and a kitchen, and others 2 rooms and a kitchen. The families are usually large, but all sleep in 1 room. The people have plenty to eat. The working man's dinner is usually soup, meat, potatoes, and sometimes a salad. His breakfast consists of coffee, bread and butter, and meat, and he takes with him to work a lunch of bread, butter, and sausage. He goes to the mill at 6 o'clock in the morning, eats his lunch about 10, and stops work at 2 or a little later. When he gets home he has dinner, and along in the evening has tea or coffee with what is left over from the big meal. He has beer and cognac to drink, and manages to live on his wages, which, with the depreciated value of the Polish mark, seem very low. From Lodz I came on eastward to Warsaw, the capital of Poland. Founded in the 17th century, it has been fought over again and again, and has been occupied by Russians and Swedes, as well as by the rulers of the ancient Polish kingdom. Today it is the intellectual, educational, and commercial center of the new Polish Republic, and as such is entering upon a new era of prosperity and importance. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the British Isles and the Baltic States by Frank G. Carpenter. This recording is in the public domain. Latvia, a war-born republic. On the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea, south of Finland and the Gulf of that name, and west of Russia, the former empire of which they were a part, are the 3 war-born republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The lands claimed by Lithuania are almost as large as New England. Latvia is about half as big as the state of New York, and Estonia is about twice the size of Massachusetts. All 3 countries are flat and covered with forests and farms, lakes and swamps, and numerous rivers. Before the World War, these republics belonged to Russia, and more than 50% of their areas were owned by a handful of noblemen who numbered less than 2% of the population. In Lithuania, these rulers of the country were Poles, and in Latvia and Estonia they were Baltic barons, descendants of the Teutonic Knights who conquered the country about 300 years before Columbus discovered America. They divided the territory into huge estates, the average size of which was 5,000 acres or more. There were many of 10,000 acres, and some, like the Dundaga estate in Latvia, contained 180,000 acres. The barons brought the lands under cultivation, and as time went on, worked them by scientific methods and with the aid of modern agricultural machinery. Many of them built mansions where they lived and entertained like feudal lords. In the meantime, the masses of the people were held in a serfdom like that described in Ivanhoe and others of Scott's novels. From sunup to sunset they toiled for the barons for little or nothing. Many of them lived on the estates, where each head of a family was allotted a plot of land for a garden and a certain amount of food. In some cases, the wife of the laborer was expected to give 70 days' work a year without wages. Then came the World War, and almost in a night the territory now occupied by these republics jumped from feudalism to the most advanced independence. At that time this region was ground between the upper and the nether millstones of Russia and Germany. For 3 years it was hemmed in by two great armies, each bent on possessing it. Germany came from the south, goose-stepping along with its machine guns, poison gas, and other weapons of war to the very gates of Riga, the capital city of Latvia. At the same time the Bolshevists, after holding Riga 6 months and stripping it bare, were in the eastern half of the country. But the Lett farmers and peasants, led by the students, fought off the Germans, drove out the Russians, and set up a new government for themselves. With the founding of the independent republics, the peasants of Latvia and Estonia arose against the barons and threw off their rule. Hungry for land, they seized the big estates from the few and divided them among the many. Every peasant wanted to own his own farm, and they wanted every noble to earn his bread, as the Lord said Adam should, by the sweat of his brow. Each of the former owners of the estates was allowed to retain only from 125 to 250 acres. In Lithuania, the Polish landowners were not so much looked upon as a separate class, and the division of the estates in that republic has not been so drastic. It is in Latvia that I have begun my travels through these young republics. In this country there are 50,000 more farms than there were in 1914. Hundreds of surveyors are still at work dividing the big estates, and the new holdings are being distributed as fast as the land can be measured. Not only the estates of the barons, but government lands also are being allotted, and an entirely new land system is in process of establishment. In the minds of the peasants, the desire to own land is uppermost, and there are several applicants for every good piece of farm property. I am told that in Latvia there are at least 150,000 men who want farms. The parcels allotted are of different sizes, ranging from industrial sites near the towns and garden patches of 5 and 10 acres, up to the 100-acre tracts for dirt farmers who expect to live on the land and support their families from it. The average size of the new farms is about 55 acres. In every case the land is sold at low prices with long terms of payment. Many of the mortgages run for from 30 to 50 years, and for the first 5 years no interest is charged. Each applicant must prove that he has enough help, besides horses and cows, and sufficient machinery to cultivate his holding. He must state his experience as a farmer and also furnish evidence of his thrift and good character. His application is brought before a local committee and, if approved, is sent to the district committee, which passes upon it and forwards it to the state central committee, which has the final decision. I have just returned from a motor trip through the country near Riga, during which I visited some of the estates that are now being subdivided and talked with the farmers. The most allotments have been made in the 3 provinces of Livonia, Courland, and Mitau, where the customs and life of the people are much like those of Germany. In Latvia, which is near Russia and is inhabited largely by Roman Catholics, conditions are quite different. Land is worked much as in Russia. The farmers live in villages and going out to work on the farms. As I drove over the country, I could see new buildings going up all about, and new roofs being put on the old structures. The average farm has a house of 2 or 3 rooms, with outbuildings for stables and storage. Nearly every farm has a dugout cellar where the potatoes are stored away and covered with straw to keep them from freezing in winter. All the houses have brick stoves so tall that they reach from the floor to the ceiling. Many of them have ovens, and in one 6-room house I visited there was a brick stove on each side of the hall. Like many of the new farm homes, this house was unplastered. It has as yet no furniture, and its occupants slept on the floor. Everywhere I went I saw women working in the fields with the men. It should be remembered that in the rebuilding of Latvia, the labor supply is doubled by the number of women. They do everything the men do, and they work from daylight until dark. Even the children have their tasks, especially in watching cattle, sheep, and hogs in the pastures. Most of these new farms have no fences, and old women, young girls, or a boy may spend all their time herding 2 or 3 animals. I saw many women spading and hoeing potatoes, and in some of the new fields they followed the plowman to throw manure into the furrows. Many of them wear men's boots, and some have dirty coats of sheepskin with the wool on the inside. Their faces are tanned and their hair is bleached by the sun, although most of them have shawls wrapped around their heads. Seeing them as they labor in the fields, one can understand how the Balts, raised in luxury, came to look upon the peasants as a lower order of beings, almost without human rights. The Latvians are thoroughly alive to their agricultural possibilities and are doing all they can to educate their pioneer farmers. There is a college of agriculture in Riga, and there are 4 agricultural high schools out in the country, together with several experiment stations and 20 elementary farm schools. Like the Danes, they have established a cooperative movement and have hundreds of cooperative societies of different kinds. Tractors and modern farm implements are bought by these societies, and farm produce is being sold through them. The country hopes to follow the lead of Denmark in dairying and intensive farming, and it is already shipping butter and eggs to London. The Letts have always been noted for their chemical, textile, and metallurgical industries, as well as for farming. Before the World War, Riga, now the capital of Latvia, was as big as Pittsburgh. Situated on the Dvina River, with deep water out to the Baltic, it was the best place in this part of old Russia to handle incoming raw materials. The city had more than 300 factories, ranging in size from Provodnik, which employed 20,000 workers, to small machine shops. For instance, I went through a textile mill today that, prior to the war, had 25,000 spindles and kept 10,000 people working 2 shifts a day. When the World War began, the Czar, fearing the Germans would take Riga, gave orders that all its factories be made useless to the invaders. Experts were ordered to go through the various plants and disable every piece of machinery. They took out a nut here and a cylinder there and shipped these parts off to Russia, crippling the mills so that none was able to run. In the textile mill I visited, every one of its 25,000 spindles seemed in perfect order, yet they are utterly useless. The same conditions prevailed in all the mills and factories of the city, save that in some, whole machines were taken away and the buildings were practically ruined. Nevertheless, many of the factories have now resumed operations, and Riga is again far along the road to prosperity. Riga was born several hundred years before Columbus discovered America. It was in existence when Genghis Khan captured Peking, and 400 or 500 years before Shakespeare acted his plays for Queen Elizabeth. It has risen and fallen, passing through war after war, but after weathering such storms, it has always grown greater and stronger. It now has a population of perhaps 300,000, or but half as many as there were before the war. The city is one of the finest of all Eastern Europe. Lying on a sandy plain 9 miles from the Gulf of Riga, which one enters from the Baltic, Its towers and domes may be seen far out at sea, and long before one comes to it by rail. The harbor of Riga is open all the year round, and ships going up the Dvina River can land their goods at the wharves right in the city. There are 8 miles of quays, and 400 carloads of freight can be handled in a day. The railway trains come right down to the docks, and goods are loaded directly from the ships to the cars. At one wharf this morning I saw 100 locomotives for Soviet Russia being hoisted by cranes from the ship's deck to railroad flat cars. Farther on were large grain elevators, cold storage plants, and factories. The city consists of the Old Town, which hugs the right bank of the Dvina, the St. Petersburg suburb with its fashionable dwellings, the Moscow suburb where the Jews live, and the Mitau suburb on the left bank of the river. I am staying in the Old Town, in a hotel facing the Opera House, a structure that cost $500,000. My room looks out upon the wide park that has replaced the great wall built around Riga in the Middle Ages to protect it from invaders. Another remnant of the city's former fortifications is the Powder Tower, which stands at the junction of several streets. One of the oldest buildings in Riga is the Hall of the Blackheads, which was built in 1330. The Blackheads were originally a group of merchants and traders who made this hall their clubhouse. At one time they were connected with the Order of the Teutonic Knights, those German crusaders who overran Esthonia, and they chose St. George as their patron saint. Later, the hall became a center for the bachelors of Riga, who lost membership in the club when they married. I am told that the Blackheads still hold their festivals, the chief of which takes place upon the Saturday before Shrove Tuesday, when there is a great drinking bout. I have motored about through the streets of Riga, lined with their 4 and 5-story buildings, have shopped in Kalkstrasse, visited the University of Riga and some of the great churches, and have made my way through the Louse Market. Yes, the Louse Market. That is what everyone calls it, although it makes me itch to mention it. I have visited markets and bazaars all over the world. I have ridden my donkey through the streets of Cairo, and have brushed against the close packed masses in the bazaars of Stamboul and Damascus. I have shopped in the cave-like booths of Tunis and Tripoli, and have dickered for silks and jewels with the Hindus in Delhi and the Burmese girls in Rangoon. I knew well the Ginga of Tokyo and the Chinese city of Peking. In none of them, however, have I felt as uneasy as in the Louse Market of Riga. It recalls the story in Exodus of how Aaron smote the dust of the earth, and every grain sprouted forth legs and a mouth to afflict the Egyptians and soften a Pharaoh's heart. I don't know where this name originated, although I suppose it is from the poor peasants who throng the place, buying and selling second-hand goods. The market is situated not far from the old walls, and within a short walk of the principal hotel. Here, in a space covering 4 or 5 acres, and surrounded by a high board fence, are long rows of little pine booths facing streets that run parallel from one end of it to the other. The crowds not only fill the enclosure, but overflow into the streets adjoining, making a motley, dirty multitude such as one finds nowhere except in Eastern Europe. As I move along, I am besieged by those who have something to sell. Here a woman thrusts a worn pair of boots at me, then a man holds up a tablecloth, and at my next step I am accosted by a peddler with antique jewelry or second-hand clothes. One woman follows me trying to sell a pair of boys' trousers. What could I do with a pair of boys' trousers? And another begs me to buy a gold inlaid cigarette case that might have belonged to a Baltic baron whose estate is now in the hands of the peasants. Everything under the sun is offered for sale, but the bulk of the goods are second hand. There are long rows devoted to leather goods, including footwear of every description. I saw good handmade boots for $5 a pair, and was offered thigh boots for $10. In the metal bazaar I found all sorts of old junk, from broken hooks, nails, and locks to every kind of machine. One booth sold only second-hand sewing machines. I remember particularly 2 children who had toys for sale. Their wares were spread out on a table not much larger than a sheet of newspaper, and evidently all had been made in their homes. Their stock consisted of a half dozen little clay birds with tail whistles, and several roosters with red combs, real bird feathers, and big glossy tails. I asked the little pinched faced merchants the price of one of these roosters. It was only about 7 cents. I bought two, and on giving them back to the girl was rewarded with her smile of delight. I spent some time outside the market, making my way through a street 100 feet wide and 1,000 feet long, and packed from end to end with buyers and sellers. I could not get through without shoving, but as I elbowed my way along, I was greeted only with smiles. In the midst of the crowd were men, women, and children sitting on the cobbles with their wares before them. Most of their articles had been made at home. I priced some black leather caps of the softest and shiniest kid, such as would cost at least $5 in any store in the United States. The amount asked was 80 cents, and the seller told me he had made the caps himself. Next to the peddler was one of the pioneer farmers who had come in from the country. He was sitting in the gutter with two poorly clad little girls of 5 or 6 years beside him, each putting on a new pair of shoes. I imagine the purchase was the event of their lives. There are more women than men in the markets, most of them selling little things they have made at home. They walk miles to bring their wares into town, and when the market is over, trudge back home with what they have left. Indeed, there are women at work everywhere one turns here. The first sight that met my eyes as my train came into the city was a dozen flat cars backed up against a sand bank, and a score of women, 30, 40, and 50 years of age, loading the sand into the cars with long-handled shovels. I could see them bending over and forcing the scoops into the sand with their feet, and throwing it in the cars with a heave that showed their muscular arms. They were bronzed faced and rough looking, and each bore the marks of decades of toil. The sun was then rising, and I venture their labor continued until dark. A common sight from my hotel window each morning is the women walking over the cobbles, each with two 3-gallon cans of milk fastened to the ends of a long pole that rests on her shoulders. She is on her way to the market to sell these 6 gallons of milk, or is delivering it to customers, ladling it out to order at their doors. Other women, clad in homespun, their heads wrapped in rags, sweep the streets of the city, and others pull carts and shove wheelbarrows, bending over half double as they force their way along. It has surprised me to learn that in proportion to its population, Latvia has fewer people who cannot read and write than there are in what we call our land of the free and the little red schoolhouse. The peasants, taken as a whole, are better educated than the farm dwellers of the United States. It is only among the Russians that much of the illiteracy is found. In 1910, but 3 out of every 100 of the recruits for the army could not read or write, and those were mostly Slavs. There are practically no illiterates among the adult Lets. The University of Riga was formerly a technical school with 1,000 pupils. The new government has made it a university, adding several colleges and bringing in more professors. When the new institution opened, it had about 1,200 students of both sexes. Now it has almost 6,000. The high educational standing of the republic is shown by its secondary schools, of which Latvia has more than Norway, Switzerland, Portugal, or Romania. The Ministry of Education has recently established a normal school for teaching English. This is an evidence of how fast our language is making its way over Europe. Here in Latvia, English is the only foreign language that is compulsory in all the schools, French and German being optional. The normal school has 300 students of all ages, many of them former school teachers and others who expect to teach. There are also governmental clerks who wish to acquire a working knowledge of English, and some who would fit themselves for service abroad. When I visited the normal school, I found one of the classes studying Shakespeare, reading the play of Julius Caesar, and discussing the dramatic construction and the motives of the characters, just as is done in our high schools and colleges. Another class was reciting in English grammar, and many of the questions they answered were puzzling to me. Though they appreciate the value of English, the Lets are proud of their own literature, their music, and their artistic culture. The Latvian tongue is one of the oldest in Europe. It is so closely allied to the Sanskrit that a noted philologist who was recently here said he found so many Sanskrit words in the newspapers that he could almost read Lettish without having studied the language. Since the Latvians won independence, they have published a huge collection of 200,000 of their folk songs composed by unknown authors of centuries ago. The work is in 8 volumes of 1,000 pages each, and it is considered an invaluable storehouse of Aryan culture for the ethnographer and the philologist. The first Lettish book was published long before there was a settlement of any kind on the North American continent, and the first Lettish newspaper appeared more than 100 years ago. When the World War began, there were 59 periodicals being published in Lettish, and of these 27 were newspapers. In proportion to the number of inhabitants, there were twice as many newspapers in Latvia as in Russia, and today Riga has 10 Lettish dailies with an average circulation of from 50 to 100,000 copies each. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The British Isles and the Baltic States by Frank G. Carpenter. This recording is in the public domain. The Empire That Was Russia. In Riga, I am in a city which for hundreds of years was one of the chief ports of the Russian Empire, and which remains an important gateway to the Russia of today. Its excellent harbor is a natural outlet for the products of the vast plains that stretch from the boundary of Latvia to the east and to the south, and its location on the Baltic makes it unexcelled as an entrepot for northern Russia. Thousands of travelers now come here each year, seeking entrance to the Soviet Republic, and everywhere throughout the city one sees buildings, scenes, and modes of dress that speak of the mighty empire of which Latvia was once a part. Today, although the empire no longer exists as such, Russia, including its territory in Asia, is still an empire in size and extent. Covering 1/7 of the land surface on the globe and extending over a larger continuous area than any other nation on earth, it is more than twice as large as our 48 United States and as big as the entire continent of South America. From east to west it reaches from the Pacific Ocean to the Baltic Sea, or farther than the distance between San Francisco and Hong Kong, and from north to south from the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea and the northern edge of India. The length of its combined coastlines is greater than the distance around the world at the equator, and its land frontiers are almost half as long. It is so vast that when it is 11 o'clock in the morning at one end of the country, it is already 6 in the evening at the other. Even European Russia alone is a world in itself, a world of vast plains, great forests, high mountains, and mighty rivers. Between the eternally frozen steppes bordering the Arctic and the warm, sun-kissed vineyards and olive groves of the Crimea is every kind of climate and soil. South of the barren lands bordering on the Arctic are the forests, which cover much of the country from the Baltic to Moscow, and extend clear across Russia from east to west. Millions of acres in this region are so heavily wooded that one could wander through it for hundreds of miles without finding any sign of habitation. These forests for years have furnished the fuel for most of the locomotives on the Russian railways, but still seem to have enough wood to fire all the engines in the country for centuries to come. Extending between the forests and the pastures, or steppes, of southern Russia and Siberia are the rich farming lands that make up the central plain. With the exception of the Valdai Hills and the Ural Mountains, it is practically unbroken by any of the natural barriers that have divided Western Europe into so many separate nations. The richest part of this area is known as the Black Plain, which extends from Poland all the way across European Russia and far into Siberia. Its soil is as fertile as that of the valley of the Nile, and in most places it is as flat as a floor. It is the garden of Russia, and it has been called the granary of Europe. Although cultivated in the most primitive manner, it has produced the richest of crops for countless generations. The Black Plain is drained by numerous rivers and streams. Indeed, the river systems of Russia include some of the mightiest on earth. 5 of them are each more than 1,000 miles long. The Volga alone is continuously navigable for a distance of 1,800 miles. That river is the largest in Europe and drains a basin 3 times the size of France. Rising in the northern part of the country, not far from the Baltic, it provides a commercial highway clear across Russia to the Caspian Sea. The navigable waterways of Russia, including the canals, are so many that if they could be joined together, they would reach twice around the world. Russia is one of the great countries on earth in natural wealth as well as in size. It produces almost every temperate zone and tropical farm product. Before the World War, its annual export of wheat alone was more than 100 million bushels, or 3/4 of the total amount of that grain exported by all Europe. In its production of flax, it was second in the world. It raises also vast quantities of rye, oats, barley, potatoes, beets, hemp, tobacco, and sunflower seed. In its mineral wealth, Russia is a Croesus among nations. In the south, about the Black and the Caspian Seas, are immense oil fields. In the Ural and the Caucasus Mountains, and also in other parts of the country, are unmeasured deposits of iron, copper, coal, manganese, platinum, gold, silver, zinc, salt, and mercury. Russia is noted for its precious and semi-precious stones, and many an emerald and diamond that grace the finest pieces of jewelry in the world came from there. Even its waters are a source of wealth, for its lakes and seas and rivers are teeming with fish. The people who live in this storehouse of natural riches number 1/12 of the human race, and are largely a nation of peasants. Before the World War, 85% of them belonged to that class, and since then, with the downfall of the nobility, the proportion is much larger. They are of many races and types, from the Lapps and semi-barbarous Samoyeds of the far north to the Muscovites, the Ukrainians, the Cossacks, and the White Russians of the more settled regions. Their religions are just as varied, including Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Mohammedan, and Jew. I have visited the empire that was Russia more than once in the course of my 40 years of journeys over the globe. I saw it first in the early 90s when Alexander III was still on the throne. I went into the country from Germany, and I remember how I was stopped at the frontier and the books and notes in my baggage thoroughly searched to make certain there was nothing in them derogatory to the country or the crown. Even the newspapers I had were examined, and those I saw lying about in hotels and stations were covered with black patches where the censors had blocked out parts they did not wish the people to read. Since then I have traveled from one end of Russia to another. I have ridden for days through the great Black Plain, where the crops stretched away from both sides of the railway track as far as my eyes could see. During another visit I went over this same Black Plain following a season of drought, and saw the people dying like flies over vast famine-stricken areas. I have ridden over the Trans-Siberian route from Moscow to far-off Vladivostok on the eastern edge of Asia, and have steamed down the Volga to the city of Astrakhan on the Caspian. I have visited the peasants in their log homes in many of the thousands of villages that dot the central plain, and have been in all the great cities and ports. Turning back the pages of time, I find many a picture of old imperial Russia sketched vividly upon my memory. Take, for instance, St. Petersburg, the capital that Peter the Great created, almost Aladdin-like, on the marshes of the Baltic. I have gone through the magnificent Winter Palace on the banks of the Neva, have gazed in awe at the Cathedral of St. Isaac, wonderful in its symmetry of outline, and have explored from end to end the Nevsky Prospect, that once gay and beautiful street, thronged on a winter day with the wealth and aristocracy of the city, wrapped in luxurious furs to keep out the icy cold, and riding in sleighs drawn by handsome, high-stepping horses. Today the seat of the government is at Moscow, and the former brilliant capital of all the Russias is merely a ghost of its former self, falling into decay and desolation. Even its name has been changed, first to Petrograd and then to Leningrad after Lenin, who was until his death the outstanding figure of the Bolshevist regime. From St. Petersburg I have gone south through the old Russia, visiting many a city almost as fascinating. In Moscow I have stood on the top of the tower built by Ivan the Terrible and looked down upon the fortress of the Kremlin, and the great city stretching away in all directions from its 5 gates. In the grounds of the Kremlin I have gone through the old palace of the Tsar, and through one beautiful church after another, the oriental splendor of their architecture revealing the influence of the Tartar invasion under Genghis Khan 7 centuries ago. I have shopped in the markets of Nizhny Novgorod on the Volga, where was held annually the greatest fair in the world, but in whose empty streets the grass is now growing. Traders came here from Siberia and Turkestan, from the Urals and the Caucasus, and transactions amounting to millions of dollars took place every year. I have seen something of the enormous commerce of Odessa, the port on the Black Sea, have steamed through the Caspian to Baku and its tall black oil derricks, and in the shadow of the snow-clad peaks of the Caucasus have journeyed through the semi-tropical fruit and cotton lands about the city of Tiflis. But all this is now in the past, and the old Russia is no more. Everyone knows the story of its end, the revolution of 1917, that forced the Tsar from his throne and overthrew an empire more than 1,000 years old, the short-lived Kerensky revolutionary government, the murder of the royal family, and the seizure of the government by the Bolshevists, led by Lenin and Trotsky. Everyone knows, too, more or less of the bloody history of Russia during the years following, a period of national demoralization and degradation that has hardly any parallel in modern history. The aristocracy, the traditions, the religion, and the culture of old Imperial Russia were crushed to the ground, and in their place was instituted the communistic regime of the Bolshevists. The right to the ownership of private property was entirely abolished, the government taking over all transportation facilities, communications, industries, food, money, titles to lands, and stocks of merchandise. There were no public hotels, no restaurants, no shops or markets, and no wages paid except in rations or merchandise. Trading reverted to the barter of the Middle Ages, the goods manufactured in the cities and towns having been exchanged for the goods grown in the country, where all the land was put under government ownership. All internal and external debts were repudiated, banking was made a government monopoly, and interest and dividend payments were discontinued. Valuables were confiscated from private individuals, and those who criticized or rebelled were lucky if they escaped the firing squad. Thousands of the hated nobility and upper classes were killed, and thousands fled from the country penniless and friendless. In the last few years I have seen scores of these Russian refugees in every capital in Europe and even in the Far East. Once members of the proudest aristocracy in Europe, they are now working as seamstresses and milliners, taxi drivers and riding masters, waitresses, dancers, and cabaret entertainers. In the meantime, during the years 1921 and 1922, the crop failure along the lower Volga had caused one of the most terrible famines in the history of Russia. During those dark times, the American Relief Association alone fed 11 million Russians every day for a year. Nevertheless, during 1922, the famine took a toll of 5 million human lives. Typhus, smallpox, cholera, and pneumonia raged throughout the famine area, and outside every town and city the bodies of the victims were piled up like cordwood. It was at about that time also that the Bolshevist policies and the threatening economic crisis on state ownership almost precipitated a revolt of the peasantry. Such an outbreak was narrowly averted by Lenin, then the pilot of the new Russia's floundering ship of state. Under the new economic policy, which he inaugurated in 1921, free trading was restored, private retail trade again permitted, and individually owned enterprises tolerated. Although the government still retained its title to all land, minerals, oil wells, forests, and other natural sources of wealth, the state still owns also the factories, mines, and railways, but under the new ruling it may lease them to private individuals or companies. With the loss of Russian Poland, the Baltic states, and other areas, the Russia of today is more than 1,000,000 square miles smaller in area than the old Russian Empire, and in population has lost about 50 million people. It consists of what is officially known as the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, together with several independent states and autonomous areas, such as Khiva and Bokhara, which are bound by treaty with the Moscow government. The Union is divided into 4 parts, the most important of which is the Russian Socialist Federal Soviet Republic. This contains most of what we think of as Russia proper, also the greater part of Siberia, some of northern Caucasia, and the autonomous units of Turkestan, Crimea, and several others. In the southwest is the Ukraine, which is larger than California, and which, with its vast wheat lands, was the richest and most thickly peopled region of the empire. The third division is White Russia, which lies along the Polish frontier, and the fourth is Transcaucasian Federation, which contains the Soviet republics of Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. The smallest units of government in present-day Russia are the local Soviets in the towns and villages, the members of which are elected by the people. The privilege of voting is granted to all citizens, irrespective of sex, nationality, or religion, who have reached their 18th year, and who earn a livelihood by productive labor or belong to the Army or the Navy. Russia is now a country of workers, and even its flag, with its crossed sickle and hammer, is symbolic of this idea. According to law, the vote is withheld from those employing others for profit, those who live on unearned income, former agents of the imperial police or secret service, members of the former nobility, monks and priests, and imbeciles and criminals. The supreme government authority in Russia is the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, consisting of about 1,400 delegates from the smaller Soviets. It meets once a year and elects an All-Russian Central Executive Committee of nearly 400 members. This committee is the chief legislative, administrative, and controlling body in the Soviet Republic, or Russia proper, and is similar to the government organizations of the 3 other constituent republics. It is presided over by a president, who is also the president of Soviet Russia. The Central Executive Committee in turn appoints the members of the Council of People's Commissars, which may be said to correspond to our cabinet. There are commissars for defense, foreign affairs, foreign trade, communications, post and telegraphs, food, finance, education, and several others. The chairman of the People's Commissars is also the premier of the Soviet Republic. It was this position that was held by Lenin, the late Bolshevist leader who was the idol of the people, and who now lies enshrined in a glass-covered coffin in the wall of the Kremlin. Behind these commissars is the Russian Political Bureau, comprising the political bosses of the Communist Party and the real masters of Soviet Russia. These men hold official positions in the various government bodies so that they are represented in every national activity and can approve every decree of the Soviet. Many people think that this Communist Party embraces the majority of the Russians today. As a matter of fact, it numbers less than 1 million people and has as members only citizens who have undergone a long period of probation when their every action and speech was spied upon and recorded. Once admitted to the Communist Party, it is these men and women who are given the most responsible and confidential government posts, and who are sent as diplomatic and commercial representatives to other lands. Under such a mode of government, Soviet Russia is trying to work out its own salvation. It is still in a stage of experiment and undergoing constant changes, so that what is true of today may exist no longer than tomorrow, next month, or next year. How long the present organization of the country will endure, no one can say, and time alone will show what is to be its destiny. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the British Isles and Baltic States by Frank G. Carpenter. This recording is in the public domain. Estonia and its capital. Reval, the capital of Estonia, is 700 years old and looks it. It was in existence in the 12th century and belonged to the Hanseatic League 200 years before the New World was known. Its inhabitants were converted to Protestant Christianity before the Mayflower Pilgrims established their first church at Plymouth. Although this country was, until recently, a part of Russia, the Estonians were on a higher plane of civilization than the great mass of subjects ruled by the Czar. They are an old race, having come here somewhere between 500 and 700 A.D. They were the equals of the Scandinavians, and they joined in many of the Viking expeditions for trade or plunder. Along about the 13th century, when the Teutons and the Danes made war upon them, they fought for 100 years before they were subdued by the German Knights of the Sword. The Germans oppressed them cruelly for 600 years, with the exception of a short time when the Swedes brought in the Reformation and gave them some measure of justice. In the 18th century, Estonia was ceded to Peter the Great of Russia, and a few years before our Boston Tea Party, the Diet here declared that the people were slaves in the Roman sense of the word. It was not until 1817 that serfdom was even nominally abolished by Tsar Alexander I. In 1860, the peasants were given the right to buy land, but the domination of the German Balts remained unchanged until after the Russian Revolution of 1917. Notwithstanding all this, the Estonians were able to get some education, and today they have about 1,300 common schools, several academies, and agricultural and technical institutes. The University of Dorpat, which was founded in 1632, was closed by the Russians before the World War, but has been reopened by the new government as a national seat of learning. It now has almost 3,000 students, of whom about 1/4 are women. Everywhere I go in Reval I see evidences of the Estonians' hatred of the Russians. In one place I passed a granite pedestal on which was chiseled a tribute to Peter the Great. My guide told me that there had been a fine bronze figure of Peter erected there shortly before the World War, but that the people tore it down after the Revolution, leaving only this block of red stone. I visited also a cathedral built by the Czar's government in 1910. At that time Russia was trying to suppress the free spirit of the Estonians and to convert them to the Orthodox Church. The cathedral cost $8 million, or $2 million more than our Congressional Library at Washington. Its dome of copper is as big as a circus tent, and, like the 4 onion-shaped domes grouped about it, was once covered with copper plated with gold. Today the roofs are painted green, the priests having torn off the gold-plated copper and sold it to replenish the cathedral treasury. I find that Reval consists of 2 sections, one down near the harbor and the other on the heights known as Castle Hill. In the Middle Ages there was a great fort on Castle Hill, and many of its stone walls are still standing. This hill is now the fashionable residential part of the city. Here also the President and the other officials of the Republic have their offices, and here the new Capitol building has been erected. About 1/5 of Estonia is covered with forest, and the finishings and furniture of the Capitol are made of native woods. Much of the woodwork is in birch of a beautiful grain, and so polished that it looks like the birchwood pianos we have in America. The doors and balustrades along the stairways are carved to represent pine cones. I went through this building with one of the congressmen. He told me that the Estonian Diet consists of 100 members, representing 10 different parties. The two largest groups are the Labor Reformists, who have just now 22 representatives, and the Agrarian Party with 21. In addition are the Populists, the Social Democrats, the Independent Socialists, the Christians, and the Bolshevists. There are 4 Balts in the Diet and 1 Russian. Along with its new constitution and referendum, the Young Republic has adopted also the national referendum, and any question may be put to a vote of the whole people at the demand of 25,000 citizens. As I strolled about Reval, I tried to realize that I was in the new capital of a baby republic. The streets of the city are paved with cobbles, and the sidewalks are so narrow that one has to step out into the roadway wherever any structure makes the slightest projection. The business buildings are of 4 or 5 stories with sharp ridged roofs of red tiles. There are few large show windows and but little plate glass. The signs over the stores are in several different languages. The new nation insists that Estonian must always be used, although inscriptions in other languages may be added if desired. In addition, every shop has a picture on the outer wall showing the goods to be had within. If a store sells butter or milk, its front may be adorned with a painting of a girl milking a cow, or perhaps with painted rolls of butter and cheese. On my way to the hotel, I saw pictures of barbers at work shaving or bleeding their patients, of typewriters and adding machines, plows and cream separators, and of household goods of every description, all painted on the walls of the stores. Reval has almost no automobiles or motor trucks, and when I arrived, my trunks were loaded on a wagon hauled by a horse with a great bow over his head. As I walked behind this vehicle to the hotel, I passed numbers of Russian droshkis. Their drivers reminded me of those I saw in St. Petersburg more than 20 years ago. Each wore a cap with a visor that came well down over the eyes, a blue coat padded out to make the wearer look very fat, and a red sash around his waist. The lower city down by the harbor is an interesting place. Along the waterfront are numerous factories, one of them a locomotive works that is repairing engines for the Soviet government. I am told that the Russians send in 2 engines for each one repaired, the extra engine going to the factory as the price of rebuilding the other. The stores here are quaint, and the common people look like pictures out of the Europe of centuries ago. Not far from the docks is a market, a square of several acres filled with women who have brought fowls, vegetables, grain, and other produce in from the country. Most of the buyers here are women also. Many of them carry a peculiar shopping box in the form of a long cylinder of bright yellow birch wood, about as big around as my head. As I motored out from Reval to see something of the country, I met scores of these peasant women coming into the city to market, driving horses harnessed to the boat-like wagons that are the typical farm vehicles of this country. These vehicles are so clumsy that they could not move quickly out of our way, and the horses were frightened by our gasoline demon. Sometimes the women drivers got down and wrapped their shawls over the heads of the animals to keep them quiet as we went by. Now and then a shaft snapped as a horse whirled at sight of our car, and milkwomen driving colts turned their carts into the plowed lands beside the road. About 10 miles from the city, we stopped at the home of a vert, or small landholder, one of the new farm proprietors of Esthonia. This man had 80 acres of well-cultivated land, a small barn of stone, and several sheds, all thatched with straw. His 6-room house was built of stone and roofed with straw thatch. Above the straw rose the chimney, also made of stone, but, like all Estonian chimneys, both in town and country, it was plastered over and painted white. The soil of this farm was comparatively poor. Near Reval, the country consists of chalk-like rock built up in thin strata as regularly as if laid by a mason. Much of the stone is, however, good building material. Farther back from the sea the soil improves. There is good pasture, and the land yields big crops of potatoes and grain. In the northern part of the country, so many potatoes are grown that Estonia is called the Potato Republic. The tubers thrive here as well as in Ireland and Maine, and are raised in vast quantities for making alcohol. Every good sized farm has its distillery, and in normal times enough alcohol is produced to give a quart and a half to every man, woman, and child in the country. Some 20 miles farther on we left the main road and entered one of the estates now being divided. It originally contained about 6,000 acres, most of it in extensive fields surrounding a mansion where the owner once lived in much the same style as did our rich Southern planters of slavery days. The house was magnificent, with beautiful gardens, orchards, and broad lawns. A part of it is now used as a post office for the country about. Going through it with the postmaster, I found on the lower floor perhaps a dozen large rooms well arranged for entertaining, and a wide entrance hall from which a carved staircase led to the floor above. Many of the rooms had big porcelain stoves. The floors were of polished hardwood, and I could imagine the balls given here by the Baltic barons of decades ago. Near this palace were the log huts of the peasants, and not far away the huge barns of brick where the crops and machinery were stored. As I stood on the portico, I could see new cabins going up in every direction, each forming the center of a little farmstead. Most of these cabins are built of hewn logs from a nearby forest. Some are thatched with straw, and others are roofed with shingles or with overlapping splints. The chimney, made of bricks or stone, is so constructed that it forms a cook stove, an oven, and a heater as well. The kitchen stove is often a low ledge built in from the wall of the adjoining room. Many of these cabins are still almost bare of furniture, and some of the farms have just begun to be cultivated by their new owners. But all the workers were enthusiastic over their independence and their new opportunity. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of the British Isles and the Baltic States by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Helsingfors. I crossed the Gulf of Finland from Reval to Helsingfors, the capital of Finland, on a little 500-ton steamer. We made the passage in only 4 hours, but the sea was so rough that, like the young monk in Hypatia, I loathed all manner of meat. As we came into the harbor we passed the red granite walls of the old fortress of Sveaborg on the island of the same name. We dropped anchor under the shadow of a magnificent Russian church, built on a rock perhaps 100 feet above the water, and surmounted by crosses and domes. On one island near by I could see the pavilion of the yacht club, and on another a popular outdoor restaurant. Rising above the houses on the shore is Observatory Hill, surrounded by a luxuriant park. Helsingfors is farther north than any other national capital on earth. Its latitude is that of Hudson Bay, and it is nearer the North Pole than Stockholm in Sweden or Oslo in Norway. Nevertheless, the climate is pleasant, and the people live comfortably here all the year round. Just how well they live will surprise you. My hotel is the Camp. It is a building of 5 stories facing a parked avenue 400 feet wide, with a stone pavement on each side and green lawns and trees in the center. I am fortunate in having the bridal suite, which costs me $3 a day, or about 1/10 of what I should have to pay for similar accommodations in New York. The polished oak floor of my sitting room is covered with a rose-colored rug. The furniture is of oak upholstered in blue brocaded satin, and the room has 2 full-length mirrors. Every morning I order a fire, for although it is summer, the air is cold at daybreak. The hotel is heated by great stoves burning wood. The one I have fills a corner of my parlor and is half again as tall as I, with a firebox 3 feet square, about the height of a chair from the floor. After a wood fire has been lighted, the shining brass doors are thrown open and one gets the effect of a grate. This stove is beautiful to look at, and I am told that it costs $400 or $500. It is made of ivory white porcelain, with pink and gold decorations as gorgeous as those on any dish in your cupboard. The wood it burns is brought in by a boy 6 feet tall, but still wearing knee trousers, and the fire is made by a yellow-haired girl in a white apron, black dress, and light kid shoes. She tells me to leave the doors open until the birch wood has turned to red embers. After they are closed, the heated brick walls inside the porcelain will keep the room warm all day. It seems strange to think of a city of 200,000 people being kept warm with wood fires. Yet this is true not only of Helsingfors, but of every city in Finland, and also of Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. When I passed through the courtyard of the Foreign Office today, I found it filled with hundreds of cords of birch sticks, the winter fuel supply of the government offices. Let us now go out on the Esplanade Gaten and take a look at the street scenes of Helsingfors. The traffic is not unlike that of a Russian city, as almost all the vehicles are drawn by horses. There are numerous droshkis, but only now and then do we see an automobile. The roadways are kept clean by women who sweep the dirt into baskets with brooms made of twigs. The people of Helsingfors look rosy, healthy, and hardy. Both men and women are noted for their love of athletic sports. The crowds on the streets are more polite than those of our cities, and there is more hat lifting and bowing than with us. Soldiers in gray uniforms go by, saluting as they pass. The differences between classes are sharply defined. The well-to-do are smartly dressed, but the peasant women have shawls over their heads instead of bonnets or hats, and their skirts are so short one can see the tops of their boots, which often reach halfway up the calf. Many of them, carrying knitted bags filled with vegetables, are servants returning from market. The chief marketplace of the city is on the harbor front, so close to the water that many purchasers buy directly from the skiffs and small boats that come in from the country laden with produce. The market is covered with booths and wagons, and men and women push about carts full of vegetables, flowers, and fruits. The crowds buying and selling move to and fro, and from 10 until 12 o'clock the scene is a busy one. At the stroke of noon the market closes and every merchant begins to pack up. Within half an hour all have departed, and their places are taken by hundreds of pigeons that have flown down to pick up the scraps. The streets are then washed with hose, and the women street sweepers scratch the dirt from the cracks in the cobbles. By 1 o'clock every sign of marketing has disappeared, and the square is so clean that one could almost eat a meal from the pavement. The Dutch are noted for their cleanliness all the world over, but I truly believe that the Finns are cleaner, even though their doorsteps are not scrubbed every day as are those of Holland. Helsingfors is a city of fine business buildings, most of them of granite 4 or 5 stories high. The architecture of some is almost barbaric. There are a number of large banks, some more than 80 years old. Every parish has its savings banks, and their records show that there is about one depositor for each family in the Republic. The stores display many American goods, and, like the cities of Sweden and Norway, Helsingfors has an American air. An interesting feature of business in Finland is the cooperative stores, of which there are 120 in Helsingfors alone, 65% of their members being working people. Such stores are to be found also throughout the country, and the farmers have 500 cooperative dairies, 300 clubs for purchasing farm machinery and tools, and more than 700 egg-selling societies. Helsingfors has some fine churches, a Greek Catholic cathedral, a university with several thousand students, and public and private schools of every description. The Finns have always prized education. When Peter the Great ruled the country, the fugitives who took refuge in huts in the woods carved the alphabet on their tables and taught their children without books. At the time of the American Revolution, the Finns passed a law that no one could be married until he had learned Luther's catechism, and parents who did not teach their children to read were fined. Today, Finland has only 7 illiterates in every 1,000 of its population, or a percentage of illiteracy only 1/10 that of the United States. Yet many of us think of this country as backward and less civilized than our own. I have visited some excellent schools here in Helsingfors, and am told that there are almost equally good ones throughout the Republic. The government prepares the plans for all the school buildings and those out in the country have gardens for teachers and pupils. The Finns proudly claim that no home is more than 3 miles from a schoolhouse. In winter, many of the children who live in the lake districts go to school upon skates. In all the farming districts there are people's high schools where grown-up men and women may learn the best agricultural methods. Nearly every town has its associations of young people who study travel and history, and every locality has its choral society and athletic clubs. In going through the streets of Helsingfors, one hears several different languages spoken. When the Russians took possession of the country in 1809, Finnish, which is now growing more and more popular, was considered a barbarous tongue, and the upper classes spoke Swedish. But soon after that, Swedish scholars in Helsingfors began to study the Finnish language and to collect its folklore. Since then it has become widely used, and it is now displacing Swedish. There are 274 newspapers published in the native tongue, and only about 100 in Swedish. In the University of Helsingfors are 3 academic languages, Finnish, Swedish, and Latin. The street names are printed in the first 2 languages, and public documents are in both tongues. Helsingfors has the largest bookstore north of the Baltic, and every town of any size sells English books. Our best fiction is translated almost as soon as it appears, and one can buy here the latest foreign works. The Republic of Finland is still so new that it has not yet built a parliament house, and so for the time being the Diet is meeting in a 7-story structure sandwiched in between stores. This building is unlike any other national capital in Europe, consisting chiefly of a great tower, one side of which contains nothing but windows. The assembly hall itself looks like the interior of a church. The furniture is of oak decorated with gold, and the floor is covered with a red carpet. Well up near the roof of the chamber is a wide gallery. The presiding officer sits at the back of the room under a ferocious-looking bronze lion, below which stands a statue of Justice. There are clerks on each side of him, and beyond them on the left are the seats of the cabinet ministers. Unlike the members of our cabinets at Washington, they take part in the legislative discussions. At the right is the press gallery, from which go out daily reports of the proceedings. According to the Finnish constitution, every citizen becomes a voter at 24 years of age, and both men and women are eligible for election to the Diet. Women now occupy 19 of the 200 seats. They serve on all the committees and take an active part in making the laws and fixing the taxes. They are not afraid to speak out in meeting, and they speak forcefully. Looking down from the gallery, I did not find that these female legislators differ in appearance from our American women. One of the leaders of the new woman movement in Finland is Anna Fernhelm, who began her cry for women's rights in Sitka when her father was the Russian governor there. After Alaska was sold to the United States, the little girl destined to lead the women of this country was taken by her parents to their estates in Finland. She grew up here and became one of the most active workers in the fight for women's rights. She holds a position of leadership today, ranking high among the representatives of the suffrage movement the world over. When I asked about the position of the women members of the Diet, Miss Fernhelm told me they made stump speeches and went out campaigning, and that they have an equal voice with the men in all legislation. Just now they are especially interested in a bill for a new marriage law that would give wives the same property rights as their husbands. According to the present law, the husband gains control of his wife's estate at the time of marriage, and he has a superior parental authority over the children. It was through Miss Fernhelm that I became acquainted with one of the leading Marthas of Finland and learned of the wonderful work they are doing. The Marthas are named for the elder sister of Lazarus, who lived at Bethany with her affectionate but rather lazy sister, Mary. Martha was a good housekeeper, but Mary seems to have been something of a shirker. Martha believed it was her duty to serve, and service is the motto of the Marthas of Finland. They are doing all they can for their country and people. The movement was started about 25 years ago when the Tsar issued a manifesto depriving Finland of many of its rights. The women then organized themselves into bands and did everything in their power to preserve and develop a national spirit. As time went on, they added to this patriotic work welfare and educational features, which are now more important than the stimulation of patriotism. 30,000 women now belong to this organization, and the local branches number more than 300. In one year, the Marthas established 15,000 new gardens and 466 new courses in cooking. The teachers travel from village to village, going over the frozen lakes on skates and now and then gliding over the snow on skis. The local organizations offer prizes to mothers for healthy children. They have exhibitions of home industries and in some respects take the place of the home economics demonstration agents of our federal and state departments of agriculture. Many of the local groups make and sell dolls to get money with which to carry on their work. Besides publishing their own weekly journal in Swedish and Finnish, the Marthas issue cookbooks and collections of songs. They are slightly assisted by the government and the local associations of farmers, and are now affiliated with the Northern Europe House Mothers Alliance. The movement has proved so beneficial that it is spreading to Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Another interesting women's organization in Finland is the Lata Svard, a semi-military organization that is a sort of combination of the Russian Battalion of Death, our Red Cross, and YWCA Women Workers, and the Salvation Army Lassies. Its members do not fight, but they wear uniforms and are trained to do things that will help the soldiers. They are divided into sections, one of which is devoted to sanitation, another to cooking, a third to outfitting the men and taking care of their clothing, and a fourth to raising funds for the army. Their annual encampment near Helsingfors is attended by women from all parts of the Republic. At the last meeting, there were some girls from Lapland who walked several hundred miles to the nearest railroad station and paid their own fares to get here. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the British Isles and Baltic States by Frank G. Carpenter. This recording is in the public domain. The Land of 10,000 Lakes. Let me give you a bird's eye view of this nation of Finland, which, like Minerva issuing full armed from the head of Jove, has sprung from the Russian bear. Its people came from Asia and were among the first to cross the Ural Mountains. They are said to have lived along the Volga about 700 AD. 100 years later, they were crowded into Finland. A few centuries after that, they were conquered by the Swedes and ruled by them for 500 years. As a result of the wars between the Swedes and the Russians, Finland finally became a grand duchy under the Tsar, and so remained until the World War. During Russian control, the Finns had their own parliament made up of the nobles, clergy, burghers, and peasants. Both sexes had the right to vote, and the country was permitted to manage its internal affairs. The Finns have always been more in sympathy with the Swedes than with the Russians. Nearly all were Lutherans, and they stubbornly resisted the attempts of St. Petersburg to Russianize them. About 20 years ago, the ministers of the Tsar undertook to crush out Finnish business, culture, and religion. They sent in missionaries to establish Greek churches, tried to Russianize the civil service and the schools, and stirred up trouble between the peasants and the upper classes. They organized a spy system, and many Finns were illegally arrested and sent off to Siberia. Such of the provincial officials of Finland as objected were thrown into prison. This state of affairs continued until the third year of the World War. In 1917, the Russian troops attempted to incite a revolution in Finland. They broke into the prisons, armed the criminals with rifles, and looted the countryside and the larger estates. Their depredations kept up until the latter part of the year, when the Finns declared their independence of Russia and began to fight for their liberty. At first they had only tools as weapons, but they disarmed the Russian garrisons and under the name of the White Army routed the Russian troops and the Finnish Red Guard. By the middle of 1919 they had adopted a constitution and established a parliament. The Finns can hardly be compared to the Russians. They look, think, and act differently, and have had a different experience and civilization. The Russians are naturally communists. For generations their peasants have lived in villages where much of the land was held in common. The Finns, on the contrary, have always owned their lands. They are individualists and have long enjoyed a large measure of freedom. Even before the war they had an assembly, through which they demanded their rights of the Czar and of the Duma at the Russian capital. They were not subject to the Russian draft, and most of them succeeded in keeping out of the Czar's army. The Finlanders are an interesting people. Living as they do, away up here on the roof of the world, their hard struggle with nature has made them one of the strongest of races. Their country is in about the same latitude as Alaska, but while Alaska has less than 50,000 white citizens to exploit its undeveloped resources, Finland has more than 3 millions and does a manufacturing and commercial business running into tens of millions of dollars a year. The Republic is about 1/4 the size of Alaska, and if our Northern Territory ever does as well as Finland, it will have a population twice that of Holland, with fine cities and towns and factories of every description. If all the railways of Alaska and the Yukon were joined together, they would not equal the distance between New York and Cincinnati. Finland has enough railroads to reach from Boston to Great Salt Lake with some mileage to spare. In addition, there are something like 5,000 miles of public roads, many of which are macadamized, so that it is easy to go almost everywhere by motor. Scientists speak of this country as the Finnish Bridge. It is a huge peninsula hanging down from the Arctic Ocean into the Baltic between Russia and Scandinavia, and its upper portion forms an isthmus or bridge from one to the other. The bridge is a huge granite plateau, and one can dig down anywhere here and find rock fit for his tombstone. In coming up the Gulf of Finland, I sailed most of the way between red granite islands, and the whole coast seemed walled with that stone. The tomb of Napoleon, under the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris, is built of Finnish granite. In the holes gouged out of this rock when the glaciers moved down and covered half of northern Europe are now the lakes of this country. Finland has been called the Land of 10,000 Lakes, although this name gives but a faint conception of its inland waters. It has by actual count more than 35,000 lakes, and its canals and streams form such a network that one can travel through most of the Republic by boat. Saimaa, one of the largest lakes, contains 1,000 islands and is connected with the sea by a canal. Many of the rivers have falls, making Finland a land of water power. The falls of Imatra are the Niagara of Finland. They have a drop of only 60 feet, and the stream is so narrow that a stone can be thrown from one bank to the other. But the roar of the water as it plunges over the rocks can be heard 5 miles away. The water powers of Finland are being developed. Most of the homes and barns of the people are lighted by electricity, and electric current runs the farming machinery, grain mills, and sawmills. Large stations are now being erected to supply power to regions hundreds of miles in extent, and at some of the falls industrial plants have been established. I spent a part of this week in Tammerfors, one of the liveliest of the manufacturing centers. It is situated about 116 miles northwest of the capital, and I went there by rail. I was about the only first-class passenger, although the second class was well filled. The railroad is excellent and the service good. My ticket was printed in Finnish and Swedish, and all the signs at the stations were in those two languages. Our locomotive was a wood burner supplied from the great piles of cut logs kept at each station. The stations are substantial wooden buildings painted white, with platforms of cobbles held in place by copings of granite. Exhibits of the local industries are often displayed at the depots to advertise the communities. Almost every station has its restaurant and a store selling books and newspapers. The food in the restaurants is good and is also cheap. one is expected to help himself. Tea is served in glasses just as in Russia, and coffee in cups. The man who wants cream in his coffee or tea takes as much as he pleases from the pitcher on the counter. My last lunch at a railroad station consisted of a sandwich and some rolls, cakes, and coffee, all of which cost a nickel. Tammerfors is the Manchester of Finland. It is a textile center with large cotton factories, linen and paper mills, and a steel plant. The town is perhaps the farthest north manufacturing center in the world. It is about 100 miles or so from the Baltic, and its latitude is about that of our Mount McKinley. It lies in the midst of forests at the junction of two long, narrow lakes connected by the Tammerkoski River. This river has here a fall of 20 feet, which furnishes water power for running some of the mills of Tammerfors. One of them, which I visited, was a cotton mill with 800 employees, mostly women and girls. Some were young and many were good looking. They wore blouses and short skirts with bright colored handkerchiefs bound around their heads. Almost all went barefooted. This mill makes calicoes, tablecloths, sheeting, and every kind of cotton material demanded by the Finnish market. It manufactures in competition with the plants of Manchester, England, and with those of Germany as well. It buys raw cotton from the United States, some of it direct and some via Liverpool. Before the World War it was supplied from Russia, and the blockade made it impossible to get in American cotton by way of the Baltic. Nevertheless, the Finns kept their mills going, bringing ships from New Orleans into the Arctic Ocean and hauling the bales south over the ice and snow. There were 300 miles of sledding between the port and the railway, and 800 horses were used in hauling the loads. Leaving the cotton mills, I went through several of the big paper factories, all the machinery of which is operated by electricity. One of these mills was founded before our Declaration of Independence was signed. It furnishes most of the paper on which the cheap money of Europe is printed, and makes also book paper for England and fancy writing paper for Paris. Some of the other mills are making wood pulp to supply paper factories in all parts of Europe. Tammerfors ships newsprint to Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, Yokohama, and Shanghai, and just now Finland is furnishing a great deal of paper to Russia because of the increase of newspapers under the Soviet government. Others of the factories of Finland use steam power generated by wood fuel, which is floated down the lakes in barges and boats. Most of the logs are hauled to the water on sleds, which I have noticed here largely take the place of farm wagons. They are used both summer and winter, as the runners are so broad they do not sink into the earth. More than half of Finland is covered with woods, 30 million acres of which are on state lands. It is said that the government has counted the trees on these lands and knows at all times just how many big logs it has available. It has more than 26 million large pines, 30 million smaller ones fit for railway ties, and fir trees and spruce for wood pulp and paper. Finland has about 300 sawmills, and there are woodworking factories of every description. With so much of the country covered with forests and lakes, only about 1/12 of Finland can be cultivated. Still, there are nearly 300,000 farms, ranging in size from 8 acres to 75,000 acres. The comparatively few large estates are being bought by the government for resale to small farmers on long-time credits. Motoring out into the country over the excellent roads about Helsingfors, I saw everywhere an air of prosperity and thrift. The fields are well cultivated, and the crops seem equal to those of the good agricultural regions of our country. The farms are divided into long strips, separated by drainage ditches, and the ground is so moist that to make hay the grass has to be dried upon racks, as in Norway and Sweden. Finland is now raising annually tens of millions of bushels of rye, oats, and potatoes, and large quantities of hay, hemp, and flax. It is a livestock country, having cattle, sheep, and goats by the hundreds of thousands, and its dairy cows annually yield several 100 million pounds of butter for export. The people live simply. The food of the peasants consists largely of rye bread and fish eaten dried, fresh, salted, and raw. The bread in some families is baked only once every 3 months or perhaps twice a year. The loaves are round, hard, and of about the circumference of a flour barrel. Each has a great hole in the center, so it can be hung on a pole and stored away under the roof. Such bread is jaw breaking, but it may be because of the exercise it affords that the lower classes have such excellent teeth. The people are fond of coffee and drink a great deal of it. Of late they have been eating more of their butter and cream, and the standard of living is undoubtedly rising. No farm home in Finland is considered complete without its bathhouse, which seems to be a national institution. Such a house has a small window and door, and there are wooden platforms all around the walls. It is usually heated by a stove or oven at one side of the room. After a big wood fire has been lighted and allowed to burn down to embers, water is poured on until the room is filled with steam. In the meanwhile, the bathers have come in and disposed themselves on the shelves, getting down now and then to beat themselves and one another with little brooms of birch twigs soaked in hot water. This brings on a profuse perspiration, after which each person is rubbed down and massaged. Out in the country the steam bath is usually followed by a plunge in a lake or stream, and often in winter by a roll in the snow. In the towns the bathrooms are heated by steam pipes, and women are employed to do the switching and rubbing. I understand that every village has its professional masseuse. In the remote districts, it is said, men and women bathe together. This kind of bathing dates far back into the history of Finland. The Kalevala, the national epic poem of Finland, tells in detail how the hero, about to be married, calls upon his sister Annikki to fix his bath. She heated secretly the bathroom with the boughs the wind had broken and the thunderbolt had shattered. Stones she gathered from the river, heated them till they were ready. Cheerfully she fetched the water, from the holy well she brought it, broke some bath whisks from the bushes, charming bath whisks from the thickets, and she warmed the honeyed bath whisks, on the honeyed stones she warmed them. Then with milk she mixed some ashes, and she made him soap of marrow, and she worked the soap to lather, that his head might cleanse the bridegroom, and might cleanse himself completely. The Kalevala, which as you have noticed has the same meter as Longfellow's Hiawatha, was formed of the songs and tales of the people, passed on through succeeding generations for centuries before it was reduced to writing. Among other things, it contains instructions to husbands as to how to keep their wives in their places. According to the poem, a husband should administer no corporal punishment until after the 3rd year of marriage. Up to that time the bridegroom is told, for a whole year thus instruct her, thus by word of mouth advise her, with thine eyes the next year teach her, and the 3rd year teach by stamping. The poem goes on to say that if this does not bring the wife to the proper degree of submission, the husband should spend the 4th year whipping her lightly with reeds, and if that does not suffice, he should cut a birch rod in the thicket and use it effectively. The poem warns him just where to lay on the blows. I quote, "Do not beat her in the meadow, do not whip her in the cornfield, lest the noise should reach the village, and to other homes the quarrel. Always strike her in the shoulders, on her soft cheeks do not strike her, on her eyes forbear to strike her, on her ears forbear to touch her. Lumps will rise upon the temples, and the eyes with blue be bordered, and the brother-in-law will question, and the father-in-law perceive, and the village ploughmen see it, and will laugh the village women." The present-day marriage laws in Finland set the minimum age of the groom at 18 and that of the bride at 15, but if a man takes so young a girl, he must prove that he needs a wife to help carry on the work of his farm. The banns are always published beforehand, and the wedding takes place at the bride's house. The groom is expected to give presents to his father-in-law and mother-in-law, and he also presents to each bridesmaid a pair of stockings as costly as he can afford. When the family is well to do, the wedding feast lasts for 2 days. some of the guests bringing food with them. If the families are poor, they spend as much as they can possibly afford, and sometimes more than they should. All weddings are solemnized before a minister, civil marriages having been unknown until the new republic was formed. Sometimes a couple will advertise in the papers that they are married, and such an announcement is considered legally binding. Theoretically, no one can marry until he or she can read and write, just as none is supposed to be admitted to church communion unless he can pass the same test. End of chapter 28. End of the British Isles and Baltic States by Frank G. Carpenter.